Flint DIBBLE is an archaeologist out of Cardiff University in Wales. And Flint exploded onto the scene back in April when he appeared with Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan's show to debunk the idea of an ancient, lost, advanced civilization. And Flint has been taking the world by storm ever since. You guys can find Flint at his YouTube channel, Archaeology with Flint DIBBLE. Seeing this war, if you will, between archaeology and pseudo-archaeology, and how the fan bases of each of the personalities in this space interact with each other and with the personalities themselves reminded me a lot of the cult space and the ex-cult space. And I reached out to Flint and I said, I'm a big fan. I've watched tons of your videos now. I would be honored if you would come onto my show with me and let me talk about all of this with you. And he accepted that invitation, and we recorded that this morning. So that is what I have for you guys. Please enjoy my interview with Flint DIBBLE, and please check out his YouTube channel. Here you go. How did you end up getting sucked into the Graham Hancock phenomena and debate?
That is a really long story. So most archaeologists that address pseudo-archaeology in the public, they oftentimes were pseudo-archaeology fans when they were younger. So they were fans of Graham Hancock or Ancient Aliens or something like that back when they were like teenagers or whatever. And then they went to university and they learned about real archaeology, and they saw how real archaeology is more fact-based than this fake stuff. And my road was different in the sense that my dad was an archaeologist. So I've grown up trusting archaeology my entire life. And I grew up on sort of Ice Age sites occupied by Neanderthals in France and elsewhere. And so for me, I was not very interested in pseudo-archaeology until a few years ago. I started seeing its rise on the internet. You know, until then, I just thought it was funny. You know, it's like people believe in aliens or something like that. Ha, that's like, you know, how could people believe in that? We have all this evidence, right? And so, you know, but I slowly realized just how popular it was becoming. And in particular, it jumped to the forefront for me when this show on the Discovery Channel came out called Hunting Atlantis. And this was hosted by this guy named Stel Pavlo and a geologist named Jess Phoenix. And Stel Pavlo was a fiction author. And when the show was announced, all of us archaeologists on Twitter were kind of like, man, another show on Atlantis. Why can't we have real archaeology on TV? Why is everybody on TV, producers want to produce this crap? And so, you know, all of us are speaking up, and Stel sort of says, hey, this is based on a peer-reviewed publication I have coming out soon. And so one of my friends said, hey, do you want to send it to me? Let me look at it. And he quickly realized that it was on ancient Greece and Atlantis. And he's like, I don't have any expertise to look at this, but maybe Flint DIBBLE wants to read it because I study ancient Greek archaeology. And so I said, sure, why not? And I said, Stel, look, if you send it to me, though, I am going to publicly peer review it on Twitter. And he says, that sounds like fun. So I published this really long Twitter thread about it that went very viral. It was read by hundreds of thousands of people, showing why this was not legitimate scholarship and all the flaws with the evidence and stuff like that. And eventually the show came out, and I saw that one of my friends was on the show. And like someone whose wedding I was at, and I approached the guy online. I sent him an email. I'm like, hey, why were you on this show about Atlantis? And he's like, what do you mean? It was on Atlantis? They just interviewed me about my research. And so then I watched the show in depth, and I realized that there was this whole trick being played where they approached about a dozen legitimate scholars and interviewed them about their research, but then clipped it into this hokey show on Atlantis. And that's when I realized, whoa, something is totally screwed up. We as scholars have no real outlet to the public because we appear on these documentaries, and then we are clipped out of context to make it appear like we were saying something we're not. And this happens in media interviews. It happens on podcasts. It happens on documentaries. It happens in all these sort of contexts. And that's when I started paying a lot more close attention to this. I was already building a following, you know, tweeting Twitter threads about real research. But then I was like, hey, this is serious. And so I started doing more research on Atlantis, and I realized just how popular it was, particularly due to Graham Hancock. And I also realized how it combines two of my expertises, which is it's based off this ancient Greek story, and I'm a scholar that focuses on ancient Greece. And the modern myth of Atlantis is set in the Ice Age, and I grew up doing Ice Age archaeology because of my dad. And so I sort of said, wait, there are very few archaeologists in the world who have these two sort of backgrounds of Ice Age archaeology and Greek history, because it's a weird combo. You know, Ice Age archaeology is one field, Greek history is a different field, and I'm one of the few that bridges that. And so I thought to myself, well, if this is what's really popular now, there's all these polls, like Chapman University does these polls every year of various beliefs that Americans have. And on average, 50% of Americans replied that they believe in Atlantis or a lost civilization from the Ice Age. And so I realized how popular this really is, and somebody needs to address it. And so I said, well, I'm pretty decent at speaking to the public. I have the appropriate knowledge and expertise to address this. Let's start engaging. And so that's how I started. And when Ancient Apocalypse came out, I had read some of Graham Hancock's books, and I quickly wrote a Twitter thread that went viral, which led to an op-ed, which led to podcast invites, which ended up leading to the debate on Joe Rogan. So that's kind of the story.
Yeah. And so that was going to be my next question. How did you go from a guy who had these unique qualifications to have opinions on this and comment on this amongst your peers and on Twitter, to getting invited on Joe Rogan, where you pretty much bodied one of his best friends, which I think he regretted having you on to do that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it took a lot of deliberation. So in a sense, Graham Hancock has been challenging archaeologists and Egyptologists and ancient historians to debates. Now that I've done my research more for a video I'm producing on Graham Hancock's earlier history, he's been trying to challenge us scholars to debate since the mid-1990s. Since he started, since the publication of Fingerprints of the Gods, before it sold 1 million copies of books and became the bestseller celebrity that he is today, before that, he was on early radio shows like Art Bell's Coast to Coast, challenging scholars to debates, saying experts don't have their crap together. They're trying to hide our history and stuff like that. He has been pushing for debates for 30 years. The only scholar to really take him up on it was Zahi Hawass. They had a couple debates in the 90s that were not, they weren't widely seen, but then they set up this debate in 2015. And I guess before the debate started, Graham Hancock insulted Zahi Hawass in some way, and Zahi Hawass stormed out before the debate started. And so Graham Hancock published this and saying, nobody wants to talk to me. They're scared of me. And so he's been pushing for this. And in the wake of all the criticism from Ancient Apocalypse, he really started pushing it even stronger. And he wanted to debate this one senior professor they've had back and forth on blogs and in newspapers for like a decade, this guy, Professor John Hoops. And but John Hoops wanted nothing to do with that. And so a few of us started thinking about doing it. And so I was very deliberate. I developed a very clear strategy that I wanted to take before challenging him. And then what I did was I wrote a public letter. Here, I can find it and read it for you if you want. Public letter. Here we go. It's kind of funny. I'll send you, you can find a screenshot if you search my name on Twitter and the term public letter. All right. Dear Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock, I am writing to take up Joe Rogan's invitation for an archaeologist to come on the Joe Rogan Experience, because Joe Rogan had issued the invitation on an earlier episode, and chat about Graham Hancock's unsubstantiated idea for a lost advanced Ice Age civilization. I am a qualified archaeologist with over 20 years of experience. I've taught archaeology at Dartmouth College and the University of Cincinnati. I currently hold a grant from the European Commission with a research position at Cardiff University. I've excavated Neanderthal caves in France, Neolithic living areas in Albania, pre-dynastic tombs at Abydos in Egypt, the Bronze Age tomb of the Griffin warrior at Pylos in Greece, an industrial quarter in the ancient Greek colony at Histria in Romania, and a fabulous Roman latrine at Pompeii in Italy. I am one of Graham Hancock's sharpest critics. Yada, yada, yada. The invitation is from episode 1897 at 2 hours, 32 minutes. Joe Rogan is talking to Graham Hancock. Joe, I would invite those people to come on here and talk with you. Graham, yes, I would love to do that. Joe, it would be fascinating to see their argument. Graham, absolutely. It would be a great debate to have. Very few archaeologists are willing to debate me. I am willing to have a discussion with Graham and Joe. In December, on his website and on Twitter, Graham invited Dr. David Miano and myself to a discussion with him at the Cosmic Summit in June. I declined because it is during my excavation season at the Athenian Agora. It is also a closed event that charges listeners and attendees. I share real archaeology widely. I am tired of Graham Hancock insulting archaeologists. He accuses us of censorship when he has a large platform. He calls us, quote, arrogant, patronizing, and afraid to talk with him. Recently, in an interview on London Real, he labels Dr. John Hoops a coward for refusing to go on Joe Rogan. Hancock also said he will only talk to Dr. Hoops on Joe Rogan and not other, quote, nobodies. So I will accept Joe Rogan's public invitation and share real archaeology with his audience. We will talk sex, drugs, and rock and roll in real ancient societies while disproving Graham Hancock's baseless lost Ice Age civilization. With or without Graham Hancock, it will be an engaging conversation. If Graham Hancock refuses this offer, then Graham Hancock is the coward. Sincerely, Flint Dibble. And that's what led to it.
I'm glad I asked you that question. I was not aware of that letter. That's amazing.
Yeah. So it was that letter. I emailed it to Joe Rogan's booker, and I emailed it to Graham Hancock, and then Graham replied, and he said, sure. And we set it up, and then more craziness went down. So in fact, so I told you about that first Twitter thread I wrote on Atlantis and hunting Atlantis. At the time I wrote it, I was recovering from surgery from melanoma that had been detected in my arm. And so they had to take a huge chunk of flesh out of my arm, and I could, I was not doing very well. So I wrote that, boom, fast forward 2 years later. Now it's January 2023. Me and Graham agreed to do this. Graham announces the debate. And then the very next day, I get a phone call from my doctor. My melanoma has friggin' returned to lymph nodes in my armpit. So I immediately have to have surgery. I remove all my lymph nodes, and I go on a year of chemo. Graham and Joe agree to delay the debate until I'm done with chemo. And then a few weeks after I'm done with chemo, I go on. In the intervening period, Graham Hancock's fans are accusing me of faking cancer to avoid going on Joe Rogan because I'm too scared to go on Joe Rogan, including this big YouTuber named Jimmy Corsetti. And so it's just like, this is the kind of crap I've had to deal with in this online sphere, is this kind of just outright harassment. It's just like, and not, hey, credit to Graham and Joe that it's not them. It's some of these fans and stuff like that, because they're nasty pieces of crap, right?
Well, I'll tell you, that's what really made me sort of the inspiration for personally wanting to talk to you. This is a channel about Scientology. This is a channel about cults. And the way I saw Graham Hancock, Jimmy Corsetti, and his fans going at you for doing nothing but speaking the truth about your science and talking facts and trying to have a real conversation, I said, holy shit, this is so culty. This is unbelievable. And I'll tell you what really got me, because I'm a Joe Rogan fan. What really got me is, first of all, the video with you and Graham Hancock was fantastically entertaining. So even if you're just in this for good TV, that was great TV. I could not believe it when Joe brought on Jimmy and that other guy to absolutely shit on you for 3 hours without at least having the thought to go, maybe this would be fucking amazing if I brought Flint back to battle with these two guys. And I thought, why would he do this without bringing Flint back on? If they want to call Flint a liar and a this and a that, do it to his fucking face. That would be amazing TV. And were you ever asked to come back on?
No, not at all.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
and then he brought Graham back on as well. He brought Graham back on as well. So not only did Jimmy and that other guy come on to dump on you for 3 hours, but then Graham came back on and Joe was personally dumping on you. Flint lied about this. Flint lied about this. And it's like, don't you want to bring him, if that's what you think about him, don't you want to bring him on and call him out on the carpet?
It's like I lied. I provided citations for everything I said. It was all up there on screen with citations to scholarship. So it's like, where's the lie? The only thing I misread the number of shipwrecks. Instead of 3 million, it's 300,000. Other than that, and I provided the citation, by the way, to those studies on shipwrecks. So it's like, where the hell is the lie? This is just, and so it's just, I don't know. Look, this is the world we live in. I think it started in this kind of culty sphere. I think you're right there. And Hancock is part of this culty sphere. It's very much a pseudoscientist, conspiracist sphere that he operates in, as does Jimmy Corsetti and all these other people, right? It's an article of faith in many ways, their ideas of this lost civilization. And in fact, you can see this by, they say archaeologists lie because they say it can be disproven. It can't be disproven. It's like, what do you mean it can't be disproven? Saying something cannot be disproven is immediately moving beyond the realm of science, because that's the entire point of science, as we deal with falsifiable facts. That's what peer review is. We reject hypotheses that do not match the evidence. And so, that's why Atlantis and whatnot has been rejected repeatedly, because it does not match the evidence. We have evidence against it. And so it's just like, but to jump to this idea of lying and this smearing of my name, this is exactly how these people operate. And it's very much the modus operandi for the world we live in with social media right now, with misinformation and fake news taking over. And it's all just about personality and stuff like that. And I mean, look, I don't really care. Like, these people can smear my name with their following, but I never had a reputation with their following to begin with. If you see what I mean, like, it doesn't harm my reputation with people who are interested in actual evidence and facts, because I have evidence and facts on my side. So you know what? Screw you, like, I mean, but if Joe does want to invite me on, I will gladly go on and share more real archaeology. But I'm not talking to Jimmy Corsetti and Dan Richards. Like, these two people are not worth my time. They make up very clear lies about me, like that I faked my cancer because I was too scared to go on Joe Rogan. Very clearly a lie. Like, it's very partly because we can disprove that I was too scared because I went on there and did it. So clearly I was not too scared to go on Joe Rogan and talk to Graham Hancock. So very, very clearly a lie, because that's what these people peddle, is lies. So, and obvious lies, right?
I'll tell you what, there's a line that you said on Joe Rogan when you were talking to Graham that it really struck me in its simplicity. And it sort of turned everything Graham was saying right on its head, which is, in archaeology, we work from the known to the unknown. And Graham's over here being like, but you can't prove that the 95% of the Sahara that hasn't been excavated doesn't have a lost ancient alien civilization. And you're like, yeah, and I can't prove a lot of things. I don't have to. That's not what we do. We move from what we know and we work to what we don't know. And I just thought it was such kind of a simple, powerful statement, because I'll tell you, I also come from a little bit of a point of bias on this, okay? In Scientology, and based on the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, the ancient alien civilizations are basically considered to be a fact. Scientologists believe in aliens. And also, I want to believe in an ancient alien civilization. It's so exciting, which is why Graham's theories have just become so popular, because that's what they are. It's pop culture. It's pop fantasy. It's pop science fiction. It's sexy. It's fun. It's exciting. And I also I consider myself to be someone who's easily swayed by a good argument, not a logical argument, a good argument. So if I watch a documentary in one direction, I finish that documentary and I'm like, this is the greatest fucking thing I've ever seen. Everyone in the world needs to know about this. And then I'll watch the documentary debunking the documentary. I'm like, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And so, I basically grew up on these ancient alien books, and so watching your interview with Joe was an eye opener for me, because I'm like, Jesus Christ, like I don't want to say, well, I'm going to say it's all bullshit, but at the same, but then seeing all the people who just want to believe what Graham says, they want to believe it, just absolutely attacking you. So let me ask you this: how do you, in the spirit of that sort of principle, we work from the known and we work to the unknown, how does that principle apply to what Graham, even at the end of your conversation with Joe, he was very, very fixated on how much of the Sahara has been excavated, how much of the Sahara has been excavated. And it's almost a do you still beat your wife question, because he knows your answer to the average viewer is going to make it sound like you don't know anything about the Sahara. But you have a different take on it. You don't have to excavate 90% of the Sahara to know what's happening in the Sahara. How, or what happened, throughout civilization. How do you explain that to an average viewer?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest problem that exists is pseudoscientists are very effective at straw manning science and scholarship. In the sense they say, hey, scientists have been wrong before. Well, no, duh. We're constantly advancing our knowledge. That's the whole point of scholarship and science, is to constantly update what we know. We're not here reaffirming the narrative that exists. My research is there to push the narrative in new directions. Every article I publish does that. And so when you look at what the actual tools of science are, there's very few things that we have 100% certainty on. Instead, we build our knowledge of the universe and the world around us and our history and our past and our present by sampling. Right? We deal with sampling all the time. If you want to understand the universe, you take a sample based on the light that comes into your telescope. If you want to understand biology, you take a sample of organisms in an area and extrapolate from there. If you want to take a sample of what's going on in the Sahara Desert, you do that. You do a survey and you do some excavations. And the reality is asking, have we excavated everything? Of course not. We've never excavated everywhere, nor could we, nor would we. For one, not everything needs excavation. The Sahara Desert, for example, and this is what I tried to bring up to him, and he just keeps ignoring it, and his fans. And it's just like most archaeology in a desert, it's visible, right? There's a lot of erosion, wind erosion that goes on. That means that in deserts, a lot of archaeological landscapes are exposed and visible and don't require any excavation because the sand is blown away. Right. And so it's just like we can do this. We can record architecture using aerial photographs and satellite imagery. We can do walking across the landscape and collecting artifacts to understand when and how it was used. And then we can take samples and do more scientific analyses. And it's just like it's a basic lack of understanding of science. And that's why most of my approach to this kind of stuff is to show how we do stuff, right? That known to the unknown, to explain just how much evidence we have, because I find that so much debunking that takes place is just arguing over one fact or another. But I'm an educator, right? I'm here to teach the public and my students, of course, in my classrooms, how what we do works, how we do what we do, how we extrapolate from it and interpret it, so that everybody that listens to me has a better understanding of what archaeology today is. And because that's what arms the public to actually understand this. It's not about debunking how he interprets the Sphinx. I mean, yeah, that can make for a fun video, but if you're not sharing how we actually understand Giza as a whole and the Sphinx within that landscape, because that's how we date the Sphinx, is the relationships between everything, then you're failing at educating the public by just simply debunking. And there's a lot of sort of studies into modern misinformation that shows how debunking doesn't really work very well. Instead, they say pre-bunk, right? And that's why when I was on Joe Rogan, and that was part of my strategy, my only demand was I get to go first, so that I could set the context of what archaeology is and how it's approached, and I could do it in a fun way. That's why I started with an Athenian pot that showed a graphic sex scene on it, and it was about context even. It was about how every single Athenian pot with graphic sex is part of an export market. So archaeology is not just about studying an artifact, it's about where it's found and its relationship with other artifacts and monuments and soils and stratigraphy in the area where it's found, because that's what informs us about that artifact, that context, if you see what I mean. And so, you know, that was always my goal. It's about trying to set it up. Like, I don't believe in dumbing down things for the public. I will treat adults like adults. You are like any student in my classroom. You know, I'm not going to use all the jargon and, like, you know, complicated language, but I'm going to share the complexity, the nuance, and the nuts and bolts of how we do stuff, you know, and that's key.
Question: do you think it was a mistake for more scholars not to directly engage with Graham Hancock earlier?
Yes and no. So I'm giving you a talk later today, actually, for Northwestern University on a similar-ish thing, how to engage as scholars. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that shows that scholars and media personalities made big mistakes when dealing with pseudoscience like a decade ago, right? By engaging with knee-jerk reactions, we amplify it. And what's happened is pseudoscientists have oftentimes invaded more mainstream spaces and used that to amplify their rhetoric and make it more popular and make it look like we're shutting down conversation or yada, 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 especially using stigmatized language like "I've been canceled." You know, that's a very effective rhetoric to say "I've been canceled." You see it all the time today. In fact, me and Graham are in an argument over who's canceling who, right? He says I'm canceling him. I say he's canceling me. We both get more eyeballs for saying that because that rhetoric works really well, right? And so, especially in today's world. And so, you know, I don't think just engaging is the answer. I think engaging with pseudoscientists takes a lot of effort and research and thought on how to do so in a deliberate way that's not emotional and that does not fall into all these traps that they set. to get attention and eyeballs. And that's why I was very careful with my approach when I went on Joe Rogan. And I didn't even make the challenge until I had my whole strategy locked down, because I didn't want to do that. And so I think that a lot of engagement has been bad, but I do think there's angles there for positive engagement. I think that not engaging at all is a mistake, because it feeds that perception of being canceled, if you see what I mean. And I think it ends up, especially as these narratives become more popular. We can now see, there was an article that just came out in Bloomberg that showed like Graham Hancock is one of the most popular podcast guests out there. He's gotten like 20 million views in the last like 6 months on various podcasts. He's up there with the top people. And so it's just like, he's very popular. We have to, these ideas are very popular. As I mentioned, the polling shows that. So we would be making a mistake not to address these popular ideas, because it's a way to get eyeballs on us, to educate what we do, how we do it, and why what we have is evidence-based. And so I think we need to engage, but we do need to think through very carefully how we do so. So that's the key.
Let me counter with this a little bit, just to throw this back and forth a little bit. Please remind me the name of like the super famous astrophysicist, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
He's got to be one of the other #1 podcast guests out there, right? He's everywhere all the time. And he's sort of made astronomy and other forms of other areas of science a little more accessible to the public. And I guess you would say, he goes on Rogan all the time and kind of debunks a lot of the stuff that Joe says, right? And okay, and then you had Terrence Howard went on Joe Rogan and made an absolute fool out of himself. And Joe spent the next 3 weeks talking about what a genius Terrence Howard was, until one of the Weinstein brothers came on with Terrence and calmly, almost as if he were talking to a child, had to build Terrence up to a point that Terrence could hear. Was it Eric Weinstein? I get the brothers mixed up. I forget what had to build him up to a point where he could then politely tell him, you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so when you have someone like, let's say, a Graham Hancock, I understand scholars not wanting to, and if I'm incorrectly paraphrasing anything you said, please correct me. I understand scholars not wanting to legitimize him in a way, but because of the nature of pop culture, his is the platform that is bigger. So if scholars, especially early, including earlier, were to engage with him, they wouldn't really be the one platforming him. They would be the one using his platform to delegitimize his arguments.
I think some of it is that it's only recently that scholars are waking up to the fact that scholarship is less popular than it used to be, right? We a lot of us grew up in earlier decades before this kind of alt media ecosystem. And I think it's caught a lot of people by surprise to realize, hey, things like podcasts actually have bigger platforms than CNN or whatever, and so I also think that so that's part of the problem. Is it's only really within the last few years, especially since the pandemic, that everybody's woken up to realize, or maybe since Trump's election in 2016, I don't know, to realize just how popular all this misinformation and pseudoscience is. But I agree with you. That's my argument to my colleagues. And thankfully, I did a good enough job of convincing a lot of Hancock fans about why real archaeology is so interesting and has a lot of evidence in its favor. If I'd not done that, I think I would have had a lot of op-eds from my colleagues saying, man, Flint made a big mistake here, right? And so that came down to me doing my homework on how I did my preparation. I mean, in many ways, that was my bigger fear, was how my colleagues would take it. And so rather than how, I don't know, Graham Hancock fans would take it, I knew most of them wouldn't. Many of them would not take it very well, so whatever. And so I think we need to come to grips with this new media ecosystem that exists on the internet, and we need to do a better job. This is, again, part of what I'll be talking about later today in this lecture, is we need to build up a better pro-science, pro-scholarship, pro-history, whatever, ecosystem online. And we have to stop trusting them or waiting for the media or the government or something to help us boost ourselves. We have to start doing it ourselves, right? And we have all the skills to do it. Look, most of my colleagues are fantastic teachers. University classrooms are not like they were 20 years ago, where people are giving up and giving snooze fest lectures. That just doesn't exist. We go in there and we engage with students very closely, and it's in many ways like a long form podcast, right? We develop an authentic rapport with our students. That's a big part of the goal of a back and forth in conversations by flipping the classroom today. And so, that kind of rapport is exactly what the public craves right now. What's not popular is super slick, presentations. Instead, what is popular is this kind of authentic engagement of a conversation, right? That's why podcasting is so popular right now. And long form podcasting in particular is you get that ability to kind of dig into the context of a topic and the details and the nuts and bolts of how you put it together. And at the same time, share your personality a little bit. And it's like, man, educators are really well equipped to do this, but we're also very scared of engaging. Partly if you see the trolling that happens in response to me, that's one reason my colleagues don't want to do that. They don't want to deal with that kind of trolling. And I don't blame them. It's a toll. It's a lot of effort and emotional effort and time that kind of stuff takes out of your day. And it sucks. But at the same time, look, if we want to share what we have with the world, look at this friggin' world we live in. We got to do something about this. We have to speak up because we're the ones with the expertise.
The trolling and the vitriol really is vicious. And I can imagine, for someone who works at a university, I can imagine if you have any question whatsoever, whether your higher ups have your back or whether they will eventually succumb and bend the knee to the hate online that people are just not used to unless you spend a lot of time in the space. I can understand the hesitancy, the trepidation about engaging publicly. If you know that your seniors, I know that's not the right word to use in academia, but if your seniors have your back and they have your back, that's a different story. But I don't know if I don't know how comfortable scholars are in that. Or academics are in that situation. Have you gotten any heat from the people you answer to?
No, God, no, they're all very supportive. I mean, and I think that that's something that, look, higher education, and I mentioned this at the end of the Joe Rogan podcast as well. Look, it's under siege right now. We are losing funding left, right, and center, and we're losing various public platforms. The higher education is just not cool right now. Neither is science. There's a whole lot of money lined up against us, and a whole lot of voices lined up against us, including very powerful politicians and business leaders and whatnot. And so, I think in general, if anything, public engagement is more valued and supported than ever in the academy. However, there's no real support, if that makes any sense. Doing so, they don't care. Look, if they get an email from some Hancock fan saying I lied, they're like, no, he's a real scholar. He didn't lie. He shared, they know that, right? That's easy for them to see. But on the other hand, it doesn't help me get promoted. There's no tangible benefits in my job from doing this. And that's the problem. That's what I think is the other issue that prevents overworked scholars from doing this. I had the advantage of the fact that I was recovering from cancer and chemotherapy, where I've been working part-time for the last year and a half. And so that gave me the time to do this, if you see what I mean. And that was just kind of, and it gave me incentive to do it as well, because I also needed to think of ways to support myself. And so, it's like, and then I also have ethical incentive to do so. So I think the issue is there's no real support. There's no detriment, though, to publicly engaging from your bosses in academia. They're mostly happy, unless you say something really stupid. But to be honest, in today's world, you'd have to say something really freaking stupid, because it's just all a bunch of noise and this kind of drama on social media, and everybody knows it. So you'd really have to put your foot in your mouth to do something to get you sanctioned in some serious way.
Well, dare I say, if any scholars have books to sell, that's an amazing incentive to engage in the public sphere. I mean, you know what I'm saying? And you hear
that's where a lot of the requests to go on my YouTube are from people that have books that just came out. Yeah.
Right. What did they say? Publish or perish is what they say, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you. This is a Jimmy Corsetti question. Now, this is someone who's been particularly disgusting and nasty to you. He's directed a lot of hate your way. And I have people in the world who do that to me. And I would definitely never consider doing them the favor of engaging with them. But that's largely because the people who do that to me have much smaller platforms than I do. And anyone in that sphere who might have a larger platform would not be interested in speaking with me anyway. So I ask you this. I mean, I know how deeply emotionally affected it can be to have someone direct the public anger of hundreds of thousands of people in your direction. Putting that aside, is it fair to say Jimmy has a bigger platform than you do?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, he has.
If
Yeah.
Jimmy wanted to have you on, and your best way of basically bodying Jimmy the way you did Graham, would it ever make sense for you to go on his program or his channel and do something similar with him?
No, not at all. Because it doesn't just have to do with platform. Like I said, it has to do with having an effective strategy. And going on Jimmy Corsetti's platform, where he has full control over editing and stuff like that, as I mentioned, we are oftentimes edited out of context, even for the Discovery Channel, right? You don't think Jimmy Corsetti, who makes up blatantly overt lies about me faking my cancer, would have any qualms about using the levers on his platform to edit me out of context? Of course he would. And then the other issue with Jimmy Corsetti is he's not Graham Hancock. Part of the reason I agreed to talk with Graham Hancock is he is very good at having a pretense of respectability as if he's a professor, right? He is not just going to make up a bald-faced lie on the spot, right? And Jimmy Corsetti, on the other hand, very much would. He makes up very clearly bald-faced lies all the time. That's what he does. And the problem is responding to that you could not prepare for, right? There's no real preparation for that kind of engagement. So I do think, again, we need to be careful about how we engage. I think there's right ways to engage with Jimmy Corsetti, but the key thing is to expose how he's just a liar. I don't consider Graham Hancock a liar like that. There are a couple things where I think I could show that Graham Hancock might be lying, but even then you have to take it with a grain of salt, because Graham is very deliberate with what he says and does. To me, it's plausible that he believes in what he sells. Corsetti, no, he is just downright a bad faith misinformation actor. That's what he does. And so I don't think there's many cases for just outright engaging with him, at least at this point. He also does not have anywhere near the platform of Graham Hancock, right? He might have a larger platform than me, but I also get a lot more media attention than Jimmy Corsetti. So, we're starting to, I'll have a book coming out in a year or two. Like, we're starting to split hairs here. He has a larger social media platform, but I have much more legitimacy and respect. On the other hand, like, Graham Hancock is listed as a bestseller in archaeology on Amazon.com. So he appears as respectable and legitimate to the public. Jimmy Corsetti's just some dude with a big YouTube channel that sometimes goes on InfoWars. And so it's like, there's a different level of a platform there. If he was to ever reach the level of platform that Graham Hancock has, then I would start being more serious about thinking through a strategy. I think as I mentioned, I think he's a more difficult nut to crack with a strategy because of his eagerness to just lie. But there might be ways to expose that lying, if you see what I mean, and thinking through how to draw him into a trap with his lies or something like that. But I also don't think he has a big enough platform to justify going on Rogan with him, for example. I think that would only boost Jimmy. While with Graham, it's different,
Has Graham expressed to you any interest in continuing to, I don't know if you guys considered that a debate, but that's the word I'll use, continuing to debate these ideas publicly, but without using a mediator like Joe Rogan, like on your channel or on his channel? Has he expressed any interest in doing that with you?
No. So when some of these ideas that I lied started becoming popular over the summer, so like the first few months after the debate, pretty much all the chatter was like, wow, Graham Hancock got bodied by Flint DIBBLE. And so it was like really cool. But then some of his fans started developing this narrative that I lied, which, like I said, I cited everything, so whatever. But then he became alerted to it and started boosting it. And at that point, he tried to engage with me a little bit on Twitter, like trying to get me to answer. But I clearly said, hey, I showed how they weren't lies. And so he sort of stopped that. And then what he did instead was when he was promoting Ancient Apocalypse Season 2, he did this podcast tour. And half the time on all those podcasts, he spent just dissing me, which to me is a sign of success. Because if he has to waste his time dissing me instead of promoting his new show, well, good. Screw you, man. But no, I don't think he wants to. I think he learned his lesson He stopped pressing for debates with scholars.
Dare I say, I mean, I guess I was naively hoping that his search would be more for, let's find the absolute truth and not just our relative truths. But it makes sense that, you know, there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. And his criticism of you and your field is you guys don't want to be open to the possibility that these other things are true. You guys are protecting yourselves. You're playing defense. You're being conservative. You're being status quo. But the truth is, Graham Hancock has reached a point in his career. He cannot afford to acknowledge that the evidence disproves his theories. That's bad for business, because the truth is, if he was just interested in the truth, and I realize absolute truth is a funny idea, but if he was just interested in the truth, he'd be like, let's hash this out for weeks. Not only because it's great TV, but because he's interested in the truth. And you go, but if he was interested in the truth, he wouldn't really be saying the things that he says, would he?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Hancock's always, he's a tricksy person. Like I said, it's tough to catch what he actually believes. I don't know. I agree in the sense that I think he also recognizes he's a savvy business person. Every time he goes on podcasts, he knows how to promote what he's doing. So he knows that he's making money off of this and that he has a lot to lose. And so I do agree. I think that calculation is probably in his mind, in the sense that the truth really just doesn't matter. It's also just a business. But like I said, he is very consistent in how he expresses his beliefs. So it's tough to really tell how much he believes in what he sells versus how much he does not. So yeah, so but look, this shtick over we're just interested in the truth is all just a bunch of BS anyway. To argue that one group is more interested in the truth than another is just, especially of the fans, like the ordinary people that follow either real archaeology or pseudo archaeology, it's just totally bogus. Look, everybody that's interested in history and archaeology, I think, is interested at looking at what evidence says. It's just a question of what people believe, right? And so I believe in the bulk of the evidence, meaning the hands-on, what it says. Other people, they're fascinated by the mysteries, and I don't really think most of those things are mysteries. I think we have evidence for them, but that's just how it is. I think Hancock made a tweet. He has this phrase that he likes to use where archaeologists like to suck the mystery out of a site. And to me, it's just like, you know, that's bogus. You know, the reality is we don't like to focus on things that aren't mysteries. And the reality is it's not a mystery over who built the pyramids. We have like 6 different lines of evidence to show that, or the Sphinx or whatever. It's not a mystery about there being some lost Ice Age civilization from the Ice Age. It's just not a mystery anymore. It was 150 years ago when people first started proposing it seriously. But now, no, we have other mysteries we're really interested in that are really relevant to today's world. You know, really hot topics like what happens when societies collapse? How can we actually interpret what causes that and how the responses and adaptations as a result are? Because those things matter today. That's a mystery. How do societies respond to climate change? You know, that happens all around them. And that's a mystery. You see what I mean? We're still working on that. We're actively publishing on that. Those are mysteries that we are actively trying to solve right now that are really cool, interesting, and relevant to today's world. Whether there's an advanced Ice Age civilization, God, been there, done that. It's not a new idea. It's been there since, you know, several hundred years. Ignatius Donnelly's book of 1881, if you read that side by side with Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, you'll realize not only is Graham Hancock just rehashing the same old idea, he's citing and crediting Ignatius Donnelly for the idea. He knows it's not a new idea. It's old and it's been debunked and refuted and disproven so many friggin' times. But since everybody's interested in it, I'm happy to continue refuting it and teach people what are real mysteries and what we really do. You know, so like, yeah.
Were you in any way a Joe Rogan fan before going on his program?
I've never really been a podcast fan, to be honest. This is all new to me. I usually get my stuff by reading. And so no, I barely even knew who Joe Rogan was. No offense to Joe Rogan, but like I never really followed the podcast world. I still don't really listen to too many podcasts. I get my information. I don't know. I mostly read. I'm a scholar, I guess, is part of it. And so I get my information by reading. Even now, when I look into and research podcasts, I read the transcripts, right? And so it's just how I am. And so I've never, because of that, I've never really been a podcasting fan, but I'm now in that world. So I follow it more closely, but I still don't listen to many podcasts. I'm not going to lie. It's just not my style. I listen to music. That's what I do.
Did you feel that Joe treated you fairly during the first experience that you had? I mean, obviously that was the only experience. He's treated you very unfairly, in my opinion, after that. But that what you and Joe and Graham did you feel that you were treated fairly during that experience?
I mean, I felt I was treated more fairly than I expected, if that makes sense. I mean, look, in the end, Joe and Graham go way back, and I knew that before going on. But Joe's also really good at showing that he has an open mind and committing himself to that. And thankfully, he mostly did that during that appearance. Though he also, he was very much, especially early on, putting the thumb on the scales towards Graham. I think I had the impression that I earned some respect from him during it, especially afterwards. He was really pleased and he expressed it very clearly to me. But even in the break and stuff like that, and so and they're on air, and so I don't know. I think that he did an okay job moderating because he gave me the time to speak my mind and he asked fair questions by and large, even if at times he was much more familiar with what Graham had to say. So I think. Look, it's impossible to be unbiased. This is something that scholars try to explain to people. They're like, oh my God, you're biased. It's like, fuck you. Everybody is biased. You cannot be unbiased. Even trying to not be unbiased is a form of bias, And so it just is because you're trying to do it in this fake unbiased way. And so, we just always have our own perspectives and they're always going to be there. And so a lot of scholarship now is more about openly acknowledging our biases so that we can share them. So instead of hiding them, because if you hide your biases, then that means you're hiding that thing that thumb that's still always on the scale. If instead we acknowledge our biases and we're open about it, then people are aware that thumb is on the scale and that creates a fairer situation. And so in some senses, that would have been a more responsible way for, I think, Joe to, and he did. He started off by saying, hey, Graham, we're old friends. So, I mean, in that sense, he did acknowledge it. So, I thought he was okay on the podcast. I think since he's been, calling me a liar, like, come on, man. Like, seriously, go rewatch the episode that you took part in. Watch the wonder you had when you held that corn cob in your hand, and it's on your face. And I don't know, but he also has not unfollowed me on Twitter. I'm waiting till my book comes out to ask him to go back on because it's his podcast. I've decided I don't want to press this issue. If he wants to play up the drama and have me on for a solo conversation, I'm available. Otherwise, I'll wait to ping him until I have a book and something to promote to see if he's willing to have me back on, is how I figure is the right way to go about it. Maybe it's the wrong way. I don't know. I'm new to this game.
I think it would be only the fair thing for him to do after. I mean, I can only imagine what it would have felt like to be in your shoes when Joe Rogan is spending hours telling people what a liar you are. I was like, oh, what the fuck is he doing? I'm like, at least bring Flint back on to defend himself. This isn't even fair. This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
When you guys finished your chat, was there a lot of tension between you and Graham? I don't know what the studio was like. I don't know if you guys walk out the door together. Did Graham seem unhappy with how things went?
Funny story. No, he seemed very happy, actually. I think both him and Joe realized by the end that it would be a top viewed episode. So, and Joe in particular was really happy. That I think made Graham happy. Graham was much less icy with me when it ended than when it started. When it started, he was very icy towards me. At the end, he seemed very happy. And then, of course, when he saw the response, he became icy again. So, he even sent me a nice email that night and I replied nicely and stuff like that. And so, it was a nice exchange. And then the next exchange we had was him accusing me of conning him and lying on Twitter publicly. And so it's just like, whatever. But so, yeah, I mean, I think part of the ending was that there's value to sitting down in person and having to look people in the eyes and say what you're saying so that you can treat people like people. And I certainly see value to that as well. And you know, one of my things that I try to teach the public always is we have to treat people as humans. I think on the internet, we're always so decontextualized from that. We just accuse everybody of being a bot or whatever, of being a paid misinformation agent or whatever the F it is, right? And so it's like, I think there is value to treating people like humans. And Graham did not treat me fairly during that. He clearly showed up trying to smear my reputation in total. That's where I'd say you could say that he was probably lying intentionally, where he's talking about me even before going on Joe Rogan, controlling the media narrative against him. And meanwhile, he's showing a screenshot of the pitiful number of social media followers I have. And it's like, man, Graham, the only reason the journalist got in touch with me to respond on you in the media is because you announced I'm debating you. So it's like, you're the one that created the situation where journalists come to me to talk about you. So it's like, man, that's totally bogus. You have to know that's bogus. Maybe he doesn't. It's one of those tough things, but like, you know, that's the issues I have. Yeah. But I think it's good to treat people like people. Yeah.
There were a few things mentioned in like the your guys' post-interview debunking, quote unquote, by the other guys that came on Rogan that when they were saying it, I was like, this is why you need Flint back on. You can't say these things and then not have the guy here to respond to it. And there's a few things that jumped out at me, and here's one of them. What I'm about to say will mean more to you than it does to me. So if I'm getting it wrong, please correct me. I know you're going to know what I'm talking about. One of here's the disproof of what Flint was saying. Here's my best effort at this, okay? My memory of this is they were saying it's generally accepted that whatever population or civilization it is that ended up being able to migrate to what is now Australia, that was done using boats. And there's zero evidence ever been found or anything left of any of those boats, but it's generally accepted that there were boats. And no one's found the boats, but everyone agrees there were boats, even though there's no evidence of them. And then, if I remember correctly, and they were like, but the civilization that Graham is postulating is also requires boats, but is so much more ancient than the other boats that everyone accepts exist without any evidence, that it's not fair for you to say we've never found any evidence of any boats from that age, and therefore that is a strike against it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So there's so many layers here to this argument. For one, I want to be super clear. That's not my key disproof against his civilization. My key disproof against his civilization are two. One is the development of agriculture, because his civilization requires agriculture, and we can actually see it locally developing in real time from wild plants, right? So it could not have introduced agriculture because we see that domestication in real time. Two, it's the quantity of actual evidence we have from the Ice Age. And that's a real clear rhetorical sleight of hand that he does. He talks about a civilization that's from the Ice Age, but he never actually goes and looks at any actual Ice Age evidence and all the tens of thousands of sites and millions of artifacts we have. And so what he talks about is that this is a global civilization that's on the coastlines. And it was global because it was traversing across, and with sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, that civilization is submerged. Okay. And that's why we can't find it, because it's underwater. So I spent a lot of time on Joe Rogan explaining actually, well, one, not all Ice Age coastlines are currently submerged for various reasons, like tectonic uplift or isostatic rebound, which is where glaciers melt, so there's not as much weight, so the land rises faster than the sea. So we actually have all these Ice Age coastlines, and we have evidence from Ice Age people living there, but they're not an advanced civilization. Second of all, we have a lot of underwater archaeology that has found A, material from the Ice Age, but B, 300,000 shipwrecks, right? So we have a lot of shipwrecks from the areas that Hancock says his Ice Age civilization should exist, the submerged continental shelves. So that evidence disproves this idea, because we don't have the pyramids, we don't have the monuments, but we have these later shipwrecks right there. Second of all, if you want to dive into the nitty-gritty of shipwrecks, I would say that the lack of shipwrecks is a strike against it, even if it is not clear disproof. For one, they are wrong. Like, these people are just wrong. Ships do not just disintegrate with time. It depends on the burial context. We have wood found from underwater that dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Hell, we have worked wood from humans. The earliest evidence for woodworking from humans, or not even Homo sapiens, from hominids from Africa, from submerged contexts underwater, because many underwater environments help preserve wood. Not all, but many. And so the difference between populating Australia or Cyprus, those are the two examples that Graham gave. Those are tiny populations using very, very small boats to be able to get across, and not sort of large global civilizations using large ships that can traverse across transatlantic, transpacific oceans. Right? And so it's a different scale in terms of the number of ships involved and the type of ships involved. To cross the Atlantic, which Graham Hancock thinks these people do, you need supplies to last for months on a boat, right? Those supplies should, in theory, last as well underwater. That's how we identify a lot of shipwrecks, is from the wreckage of other stuff that was in the cargo, right? And so if you're talking about transoceanic ships, something totally different. If it's a giant global civilization using giant transoceanic ships that can traverse for months, again, we probably should have some evidence of that in all of our underwater archaeology that has been done. So that, yeah, they're just making crap up is what I'm trying to say. They don't understand how materials preserve, nor the state of archaeological evidence, the context within which this evidence is found. Right?
In the first part of your conversation with Joe, where you were pre-bunking Graham, and because I've watched it through many times, Graham seemed genuinely confused why you were spending so much time focusing on evidence of widespread hunter-gatherer populations during the Ice Age, when his position seems to be these two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have all these hunter-gatherer civilizations being contemporaries with an advanced ancient civilization. There's what advanced it means seems to be a shifting line. In your opinion, are these mutually exclusive? Like, because Graham would say, you're not even open to the possibility that these things could exist side by side. Are you not open to the possibility? Is it impossible? Does the presence of those hunter-gatherer civilizations make what Graham is saying impossible?
Having hunter-gatherer civilizations does not make advanced civilization impossible. No. In the sense that, as he brought up, we have hunter-gatherer societies today, and we have, settled urban societies today as well. So obviously, those two can exist side by side. Nobody's debating that. The difference is that we have fairly good coverage. We have sampled all over this planet, from the deserts to the rainforests to the underwater, to continental shelves, to coastlines, to temperate areas, to Arctic areas, to whatever. Every continent, every country in the world has thousands upon thousands of archaeological investigations that have been done. We have very good coverage. And if what you're talking about is a large global civilization that lived in cities and built pyramids and temples and things like that, monumental architecture, and had agriculture and stuff like that, the coverage we have of archaeological sites from the end of the Ice Age is mutually exclusive and proves that this kind of advanced Ice Age civilization is impossible. There's simply no space left for it, if you see what I mean. For the scale of what he is talking about, an advanced global civilization. If we're talking about, could we find an isolated monument from earlier than we have now? Yeah, for sure. We could find something that's, a large scale monument from the earliest right now, or something like 11,000 BC-ish, from like Göbekli Tepe and that region and whatever. We have monuments from earlier than that, by the way. But if you want to get something that large, maybe we'll find one that dates to 12,000 years ago. Maybe we'll find an example of hunter-gatherers, because that's hunter-gatherers that are building Göbekli Tepe, by the way. And how do we know that? Because we study their foodstuffs and what they eat. They're hunting and gathering. They're not agriculturalists, right? We know that from what they eat. That's the definition of it. So am I trying to say that we're not going to find another large stone monument that dates earlier than the ones we have? Well, we might. That's fine. But what there's not room for is an interconnected, large-scale civilization like this that he describes. That we have good enough coverage, is what I'm trying to say. We really do. Every state in the country, every country in the world, underwater, above water, in deserts and whatever. We have thousands of sites in all those different biomes and regions. And so like we have good coverage, and they make the argument, oh, but we stopped digging at a certain layer. That is bogus. Most archaeology takes place due to construction activities, right? So we don't just stop digging because we're in the Clovis layer. We continue digging because the construction is going to come in. The construction workers are going to come in, and we need to clear out the area so that they can put it in the building, right? And so it's just like, that's what most archaeology is. Most of those underwater shipwrecks are things like salvage and whatnot. It's not like due to just a scholarly project that has a specific aim and hypothesis that they're testing and things like that. Most archaeology is open-ended, written into laws in countries that relates to infrastructural developments. And at the same time, a lot of archaeology is not just excavation, it's surveys, it's LiDAR, it's aerial photographs, and it's satellite imagery. That expands our coverage beyond even the excavated area. And so if there's a civilization with major monuments, well, in some areas where there's erosion, they should be showing up, just like they do for every other period in history, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so it's mutually exclusive. The idea is too big to fit in with what we have.
Yeah. It seems to me the part of the interview where I really started to become apparent to me on Graham's side that I was like, uh-oh, there's something more going on here than just to care about the facts, is when he started to very, very emotionally respond to you in a defensive and angry way, where he's just angry that no one's taking him seriously and you're not engaging in these seriously. And so if I were to put myself in Graham's shoes, I might go, perhaps it's not someone like you saying there's no evidence for it that he takes issue with. It's someone like you saying the evidence that we have says it's impossible. And I'm wondering if you feel that the evidence that exists in archaeology does make Graham's claims completely impossible, or are you like, well, yeah, and there could be men on Mars, but we can't disprove that. Like, where do you stand on this? Is it just, hey, look, there's no evidence for it, and you can dance around in Fantasyland if you want, but it's not our job to engage in fantasy. It's our job to move from the known to the unknown. Or do you generally feel that the evidence that exists makes Graham's claims completely impossible?
I mean, it makes it as completely impossible as science can be. Okay. I mean, like it's like saying men on Mars. I mean, come on, it's as possible as that, which means it's pretty damn impossible. Maybe we're not going to be 99. Maybe it's 99.9999% impossible, but we have the evidence to disprove it and discard it as a plausible hypothesis. And that's what people need to recognize. The people think that we need 100% certainty. But again, that's not how science works. Science never has worked that way. It's not how scholarship works. It's not how the world around us works. We don't make decisions with 100% certainty. And that's, again, straw manning science. It's creating this idea that science should be perfect, when we need to recognize that science is messy. And it's built on what is worth investigating and what hypotheses are more plausible and less plausible. And to be frank, his hypothesis is about as implausible as a hypothesis can be. Does that make it absolutely impossible? I mean, that's what people are saying. It's Atlantis of the gaps, like God of the gaps type thing. Sure, we'll never have complete coverage, though. It's just not possible for a variety of practical reasons. So could anything be in those gaps? Sure, there could be a spaghetti monster hidden behind the moon as well. It's just like, so in that sense, nothing is impossible. But this is as impossible as anything else is, if you see what I mean. So that's what I would say. And to argue for 100% certainty, that's just not how scientists work. And but there's no point. Where are you looking for Atlantis? You say you want to look in the rainforest. We're already looking in the rainforest. You say you want to do stuff underwater and in the desert. We're already doing that. I'm hoping to have one of my good friends on my YouTube soon, George Leader. He just did a major survey across like deserts where he spent like a month just hiking and looking for Ice Age remains, and he found lots of them. Right? We're doing exactly what he wants us to do. So to say we're not doing these kind of investigations is just either a lie or being ignorant, about what archaeology really is. And that's why I kept going in there and hammering home. We are doing this. We're searching those areas. So stop telling us to search them. Support us searching them if that's what you want, because we're doing it.
I hope you do do more to build a platform for yourself and grow your channel. There's a scholarly channel. I assume it is. I don't know the actual person behind the channel, but it's called History for Granite, and it's spelled Granite. And it's a deep dives into the pyramids, and not in a pseudoscience way. It's an example of something that's a very niche channel that you think, my God, what's the appeal for this? It's unbelievable. It's got over 250,000 subscribers, and I think I'm not sure if there is an archaeology channel that's tried to approach YouTube in that way. Are you aware of any?
I mean, there's several large archaeology channels. I'm not personally a fan of History of Granite. I think a lot of the information they put out is good, but they have this weird rhetoric and chip on their shoulders against some scholars and Egyptologists.
Do you know if the person behind the channel is a scholar?
No, not at all.
Oh, it's
I mean,
one of
meaning
these.
they're not a scholar. They're not a scholar. I think that they mostly read scholarship and mostly give accurate information, but it's that chip on their shoulder against Egyptology that I have an issue with, because it goes back to that stigmatized rhetoric. Like, and I think that comes out of some of Hancock's claims about, I don't know, people like Zahi Hawass, like hiding Giza from the public. And it's like, I'm not a giant fan of Zahi Hawass. I think he's a little over the top when he speaks to the public, but he hasn't done any of those things. It's not like he locks down, he's not even responsible for Giza anymore. B, he didn't do that. He let on a lot of projects from different scholars to do things, and he promoted, public scholarship. People smeared his name in very unfair ways, and this channel promotes some of that anti-intellectual rhetoric. So I'm not a giant fan of History for Granite, though a lot of their information is accurate. So I don't want to deny that. I just don't like anybody that I think this anti-intellectual attitude is a problem in today's world. If you see what I mean.
I didn't realize that was the bent that channel had. Here's what confuses me about someone like Graham Hancock, who would spend untold tens of thousands of hours, I'm guessing, just immersing himself in this field that he's essentially criticizing. Why not criticize it from the inside? Or is it just convenient enough to be able to criticize it from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to it's what's called stigmatized rhetoric, where you're basically saying I'm being canceled. They're trying to hide what I'm trying to say. And it's a very effective appeal to the public, right? To say, I'm being canceled because I have information they don't want you to hear. So therefore, and so he's very good at that. I mean, Jesus, the idea of stigmatized rhetoric goes back thousands of years. There's nothing new with it. It's just an effective rhetorical tool. But it's one thing that I always say to be careful of. One way to identify pseudoscience is when somebody is trying to sell their ideas to the public rather than to experts, because the public is not qualified to judge this kind of stuff, because the public doesn't know the details of archaeology. So how can someone, Joe Q Public, say, hey, yeah, I actually have the framework to judge whether Graham is right or wrong? They know nothing about what modern archaeology is about. And so it's one of the easiest keys to say, hey, this person is A, they're saying I know more than the mainstream, and B, instead of going and trying to convince the mainstream that they're right, they go ahead and try to convince the public. Look, he always brings up like Clovis first, right? Which is this idea that existed for about 30 years in American archaeology, maybe 50 years, somewhere from like 1960 to about 2000, or 1950 to 1990s is when this idea was very popular, that the peopling of Americas took place. The start of it was when this ice-free corridor appeared about, I guess it was like 12,000 years ago, from Alaska down to the Americas. And that coincided with the appearance of these Clovis points, right? I just had one right here. Whatever, I put it down somewhere. Oh, here it is. So Clovis points like this. And so it was this Clovis first idea that it required this melting of the glaciers. And it took a long time to overturn it, because you have one site here where some of the dating maybe looks problematic. Then you have another one over here where, again, you could see some issues. And it took a certain amount of preponderance of evidence to overturn that idea of Clovis first. And now we know pretty much for sure that there's pre-Clovis populations in the Americas, and they probably came down on the coast of the Pacific. It's called, the new hypothesis is the Kelp Highway, where they followed this sort of biodiverse coastal areas. And so, the scholars, though, that overturned Clovis first, they didn't go and say, hey, public, I'm right. My colleagues are all assholes and they're all wrong. No, They went and they kept presenting and publishing, and they obviously shared their stuff with the public as they should, but they didn't do it to convince the public. They just said, hey, these are these debates going on. I think my colleagues are wrong, but they have reasons that they think I'm wrong. Right? That's what most of them are saying. And and they all kept their jobs. They kept publishing. They kept directing projects. And they eventually overturned and convinced their colleagues that they were right. Because that's how science works. That's what we're all trying to do. We all have our hypotheses that we are trying to convince our colleagues are right. That's what we do when we publish a paper. And this is also where the public gets things wrong, where it's like one peer-reviewed paper is not fact. Right? It's not consensus, if you see what I mean. It takes a preponderance of peer-reviewed papers on a topic before consensus is reached, and it ends up in college textbooks and stuff like that. And so, it's like science is constantly a discourse. We all think we are right and our colleagues are wrong on various things. That is how this works. I think some of my best friends are wrong on various issues of ancient Greek, food production and stuff like that, and urbanism and climate change. And on the other hand, I think other ones are right. And we keep conversing and we share evidence until eventually one of us demonstrates that this idea, maybe it's a combo of our ideas. That's usually how it works. It's a combo of our ideas that merges together into a new narrative of the end of the Bronze Age in the Greek world, right? And so that's how science works. We convince each other because we are the experts who know the evidence. So therefore, we're the ones that need to be convinced because we're the only ones that are qualified to judge. And that might sound gatekeepy, but fuck off. How can you judge my presentation of animal remains from Mycenae or Knossos or whatever if you don't understand the evidence? How can you judge this? It doesn't mean you need a degree. It means you need expertise, which a degree might be a shorthand for it. But I also think that my colleagues who don't know animal bones but understand architecture, they don't have the ability to judge me either because they don't have that specific subfield expertise, if you see what I mean. And so it's not a degree, it's expertise.
I said earlier in this chat that I'm someone who's very easily swayed by a convincing argument. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I've been, went down the rabbit hole on this History for Granite channel is I'm like, there is no way this person could be as knowledgeable about this subject without being one of the world's foremost experts on this. And it's almost like what happened with me in that channel is a perfect example of what you're talking about. How is John Q. Public in a position to be able to judge the veracity of the statements or the quality of the information when I have no framework, no context, nothing to compare it to? And I feel like the videos, the information on that channel is presented so well. And that's like what a good documentary is. The information is presented so well, but you don't have the ability to judge the quality of the information.
Exactly. And I mean, this is why I keep telling my colleagues we have to engage more, especially in this new environment of misinformation, but also where we can get our voices out there. People, social media, especially 10 years ago, was filled with optimism for being able to connect with celebrities and scholars. And I think there's still that optimism there, but we have to go and find it. And I think this sort of long form conversations are effective for that because we can establish ourselves as the humans that we are. And we can try to break those bubbles of those perceptions of people that are saying science is perfect and blah, blah, blah. Nah, it's just as perfect as you and me. We're all imperfect creatures. And so, that's what it is. But we're all doing our best to understand the world around us, using our experience and expertise to move that conversation forward. And so, and like I said, I don't want to rag too hard on History with Granite because I do know that most of what they present is factual. From what I've gathered from other people and from my own watching. I just have an issue with his chip on his shoulder against scholars, which I think is damaging to the information environment around us. But yeah, I think anytime there's a very slick presentation, we always should have our hackles up. It doesn't mean we shouldn't enjoy slick presentations. I mean, I make slick presentations sometimes too, right? When I speak to the public about this stuff. And so, there's a value in us giving slick presentations. But at the same time, look, the reality is nothing is decided. And I think what we need to be doing is convincing the public to trust experts again. Because we live in a period where there's a lot of distrust in experts for a wide variety of reasons. which I don't think we have time to get into, but a huge variety of reasons why that's very popular right now. But look, experts are people like everyone else. And in the end, I think we're all experts, just in different things. Like I said, I don't like to dumb things down for the public. Some of that is the understanding that everybody's quite intelligent. It's just about what we choose to be interested in. It's like history of Granite. He's very knowledgeable in Giza and the pyramids because he's really interested in it. So he reads a lot, and then he synthesizes that into these slick presentations. And it's effective because he does that research, and he's knowledgeable and smart. Just like everybody else in the world, we're all knowledgeable and smart, just in different topics, whether it's baseball or fashion or politics or whatever the hell it is we're interested in. And but I think we definitely need to start realizing that experts are people too, and most of us are just trying to do the best we can. And that means we do put our foots in our mouth sometimes, and that's life. You know?
So let me ask you this. You made a great point that it's not about a degree, it's about expertise. And one of the things that makes Graham so effective is he does seem to have an unbelievable amount of expertise. Just like the History of Granite channel, it seems to John Q. Public that there's tons of expertise. What is the difference between the expertise that Graham has and the expertise that an archaeologist would have? Because one of the questions I was going to ask you a few moments ago before I had to reword it was, in all the time Graham's been talking about this, he could have just become an archaeologist and then spoken about all of his theories with at least the expertise or the gravitas of an insider. Like when Scientology put together its anti-psychiatry front group, instead of just having a Scientologist be the one to say psychiatry is bad and evil, they actually found a psychiatrist willing to co-found the group and be the one to say psychiatry is terrible. Graham Hancock could run around calling himself the world's preeminent archaeologist, calling bullshit on archaeology, but he doesn't. He never became an archaeologist. What's the difference between the expertise Grant has and the expertise he would have if he became an archaeologist?
Well, so that's kind of, sorry, Graham, I'm going to insult you here. So, you know, I went into that debate having read a lot of Graham, having listened to a lot of Graham. Like I said, I did my homework. That's the key lesson if you want to engage with pseudoscientists, is do your homework. Don't accuse Graham Hancock of being ancient aliens like a lot of my colleagues do, because he doesn't believe in that. He believes in Atlantis and this lost civilization. It's a different sphere of pseudo-archaeology that sometimes overlaps, but sometimes doesn't. And in his case, mostly doesn't. So I had a certain level of respect for Graham's expertise going into Joe Rogan's studio, because I've read his books. He has a lot of footnotes. He's done a lot of traveling. He's seen a lot of stuff firsthand, and he's gotten a lot of behind-the-scenes site tours from my colleagues. He's had a lot of email exchanges with my colleagues on the state of research of various topics, and he's obviously a very smart guy, right? I have no doubt in Graham's intelligence. But by the end of that conversation, I was struck by a different feeling, which was just how shallow his knowledge was. He had a very shallow understanding of, I knew he had a shallow understanding of the field as a whole and how it works. That you can tell immediately from the kinds of things that he does, where he does not take the time to understand the depth of how we do our research, right? How we excavate, how we do surveys, the methods we use, and the ways in which evidence is preserved or destroyed. You know, the way we call it taphonomy or formation processes. We were talking about with shipwrecks, how wood can preserve underwater. That's the study of the evidence we have, how it survives, how it doesn't survive, right? And so that's something that's drilled into all archaeologists, is to understand formation processes, how stuff survives and doesn't, and also to understand the relationships like stratigraphy, different soil layers and why they matter, or architectural relationships, how walls bond or abut, and how that relates to phasing and stuff like that. And so I knew he was very shallow on methods. What I did not expect was for him to have a very shallow understanding of some of the sites that he goes to. And I don't know if that was intentional on his part going into the debate, but he really did not want to talk about any archaeological sites with me. He specifically wanted to focus on non-archaeological sites, things like geological features like Yonaguni or Bimini Road or whatever. He wanted to talk about the rhetoric of the field and stuff like that in the media. As soon as Joe Rogan tried to get us to sit there and talk about Gunung Padang, this site in Indonesia where Graham's buddy, Danny Hillman, has done geology there. And to understand the site, before I went on Joe Rogan, I had to track down the lead Indonesian archaeologist there, and I had him on my YouTube because so much of the information online is not in English, or the stuff in English is filtered through the pseudo-archaeology bubble. So I got in touch and reached out and found that the lead excavator there, and I got to know the site. And so he did not want to talk about it though, because he knew that I had done my research on that site. And so same thing with other sites like Giza and elsewhere. He really did not want to talk archaeology with me. And it was clear that what he does is he dives into a little bit of the literature and he sends some emails and gets a site tour. And then he focuses on the details that suit his narrative. And his research sort of stops at that point into a site, is what I sort of learned from the debate, or at least that's what I think, because I was struck. I expected to have a rigorous debate about something like Giza or Gunung Padang or some of these archaeological sites that are, underpin his narratives, but he didn't want to. And he just sort of spoke his general rhetorical thing that he says about a site. And then I showed why that was wrong. And then he left it and said, I wanted to go talk about something else. And so in that sense, he's not as diligent, or I don't know the right word. He doesn't do as much in-depth research as I actually thought he would into some of the sites that he goes to, aside from not understanding the methods and research goals of archaeology itself. I was shocked that he'd not done more reading and understanding of some of these sites and was not willing to defend it to my face. I thought he would gish gallop me more effectively, let's say. If you know what gish gallop is where you spew a lot of facts that are not facts, and then I'm stuck having to debunk a few of them. It's a common tactic. I expected him to do that, and I would have thought he would have the depth to do that, but he either chose not to or just didn't because he didn't have that depth. I'm not sure which. Yeah.
Well,
sorry,
when your entire brand and everything you've been standing for 40 years or whatever is dedicated and devoted to pushing a certain narrative, I think it's worth noting that there is a disincentive to consider facts. I mean, just reputational and a financial disincentive to seriously consider and accept facts that disprove what's been making you all this money. And I know not everyone's motivated by money, but money is money and money does matter. And it's just like, if you want to talk about a bias, I mean, it's a huge bias. Like,
of course,
it in my opinion, it's why Graham wouldn't be like, hey, Flint, wouldn't it be great for us to do 20 hours of podcasts together about this subject and hash it out? He has a financial disincentive, and that's a problem for me, because I've always loved his stuff. And it was watching your guys' chat that I was like, oh, fuck, there's something more going on here.
You're not alone. Like I said, 50% of people agree with Graham and his ideas. There's a very common thread. I mean, and so you're not alone. And I agree. I think he realized that. And I think it also was a wake up maybe for the larger pseudoscience community to be careful when they challenge people to debates. And because, if a real scientist does their research, not only into the science and how to educate public in this era of misinformation, but does the research into that particular pseudoscientist and how they operate, we're smart people too. We can develop strategies that are effective in today's world. And we need to get better at that and a little more assertive at capturing the public into believing in the evidence, the real evidence that's out there for what science and scholarship is built upon. But yeah, I mean, look, like I said, we're all biased, so I don't blame Graham for being biased, I suppose. But I definitely I don't know. He's playing this game now where he's trying to smear me. So screw him too. I guess is the right way to put it.
Last question. There was a hugely important question I couldn't believe Joe Rogan never asked you. He didn't ask you a single question about Indiana Jones.
Yeah, what do you want to know? Indiana Jones occupies a reality where pseudo-archaeology is real. And so it's a fun little reality there where ancient aliens is real, Atlantis and all this stuff is real. It's all real. And crystal skulls and all that kind of, the Ark has biblical powers. That's the world he occupies. And I actually kind of find it funny. It's one of my own things that I have not really figured out. And maybe you have an idea. I don't know, because Scientology, I think, peddles in this weird symbiotic relationship between fiction and pseudo nonfiction, purported nonfiction, right? And this belief system. And so, you know, stuff like even Lord of the Rings, Numenor, you know, like the island nation of Numenor, that was based off of Atlantis, and not Plato's Atlantis. It was based off the pseudo-archaeological version of Atlantis developed by Ignatius Donnelly. And so, you know, it's like there's this really, and Ancient Aliens is based off of, you know, various science fiction ideas as well. And even the original pseudo archaeology version of Atlantis, this civilization, lost civilization, whatever, that was based off of a fiction book written by Francis Bacon in the 17th century, right? Called The New Atlantis. That was the first description of this idea of a lost civilization with survivors. Because in Plato's version, there's no survivors. It's just a civilization that goes to war, it's destroyed. Right, you know, it's basically like a Greek city-state, really, and it turned into a fictional novel by Francis Bacon, where there's this global civilization with survivors that have advanced technology, and then that has this symbiotic relationship that goes back and forth between pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history and fiction, and it's like, it's really weird. And like, I love fiction. I was a big Indiana Jones fan. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. I just finished Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I wanted to live stream it, but my computer wasn't up for it. And like, you know, it's just like, but the plot of the Great Circle is basically right out of Graham Hancock. It's about a lost civilization with advanced technology and Noah's Ark and like all this kind of stuff. It's like right out of Hancock, basically. And it's like, I wonder how some of the fiction from there will soon be pulled into pseudo-archaeology narratives. And I don't really understand how to tackle that, because I love fiction, and I think fiction's great when it's fiction. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, the relationship with Scientology and cults and fiction?
Well, Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology managed to figure out how to take pure fantasy and turn it into what Scientologists believe is scientific reality. You know, you want to talk about past lives and teleportation and telekinesis and telepathy and these, you know, spiritual godlike powers. And Scientologists have all lied to themselves and each other that they have these abilities. And you're like, you obviously don't, but we're all going to pretend we're living in this bubble, you know? I mean, all of the upper advanced Scientology auditing levels, the OT levels, is literally sitting in a room by yourself with an electropsychometer or a potentiometer, a variable resistor, holding the cans in your hand, and thinking thoughts to yourself and looking for reactions on the meter. And you believe what you're not really thinking thoughts to yourself. You're telepathically speaking to the half-dead alien spirits that are stuck to your body, but you have the power of telepathy, and you're not talking to yourself, you're talking to them. And the reactions on the e-meter aren't coming from your body, it's coming from the body thetans that are stuck to your body. This is pure fantasy. I mean, and to put it best, this is pure fantasy. And even the Scientology commercials is when religion and science meet, and you're like, show me the science. There's no science. But a Scientologist would tell you, oh my God, they go, Scientology isn't something you believe. This isn't there's no faith here. This is evidence-based research. And you're like, show it to me. But you know, it's funny. In Scientology, I thought anecdotal evidence was the highest level of evidence. I didn't find out until later that, like, what are you talking about? Like, anecdotal evidence is trash. It like barely accounts for anything. Like, that's the most biased form of evidence. But the fact that I even thought that is an example of the culture that Scientology instills, that they're tricking people into thinking this is science. And therefore, kind of like Graham Hancock tricks his viewers into thinking he's giving you science. And so you don't feel like you're being tricked into something. You feel like, well, that's the science. That's what Joe says all the time. This is the science. This is the evidence. And you're like, no, that's what someone said was evidence. That evidence shows what someone said it showed. Like, you're not even qualified. You're just taking someone's word for it. That's not science.
Well, I mean, in the end, science is that too. And that's where I want to stress. That's why we have to start trusting experts more commonly, because that is required for science. Like, I trust my colleagues to accurately report the results of their experiments or their tests or their analyses or their excavations, right? I have no choice but to do that. We can then test it later on by going back and restudying it and stuff like that. And occasionally it turns out, in very few cases, we have scientists that actually are frauds, right? We do have examples of that. And their ideas were seeded for a while in the literature, but they were just lying. In other cases, it turns out that they were not frauds, but they made a mistake or something like that. That certainly happens too. I mean, like I said, scientists are people as well. But for science to advance, we obviously have to trust our colleagues. We have no choice. And so, you know, I think it's better to acknowledge that science is also based on belief, but based on belief in each other, right? But based on belief in our fellow humans, that most of us are working to advance knowledge out of a desire to advance knowledge. And so that is just the reality of how scholarship and science works. And what we need to do is make sure people realize that, so that they will trust us more. Because I don't know what else to tell you. My studies on animal bones are not hiding any lost technology or something like that. I don't have much financial gain to do that, to excavate a site or whatever. Yes, I have a career that I have where I get paid peanuts to do it, enough to live on, I suppose, but certainly not wealth. But it's like, you know, that's what we need to make ourselves more humane, so that people realize that we're not some monolith. That's not what science is. Science is a bunch of people who are mostly well-intentioned, working to understand the world around us. And that's what it is. And our societies are built upon trust. I trust the pilot flying the plane. I trust the person driving the car right next to me on the highway. Right? There's no way we can participate in society without trusting our fellow citizens around us. And so, you know, we need to instill more of this empathy and trust, and not less. And we need to demonstrate why certain actors are acting in bad faith, because some of them are. Some of them very, very much are. And I would argue Scientologists, I would argue pseudo-archaeologists, the vast majority of the people disseminating this kind of information at the top are acting in bad faith. And so, you know, it's a matter of convincing the public to trust us again. And that's a long uphill battle. It's going to take a long time for people to have faith in education and science, because, you know, right now it's clear that there's a lot less faith in education and science than there was 10, 20 years ago. And we have to work at that.
What would your thoughts be about the statement? Like, it's one thing to try to get people to trust science as opposed to pseudoscience, but what would you say about the statement? What makes science science is that even scientists don't, quote, trust the science. You're constantly testing, you're constantly disproving. Yes, like you said, to a certain extent, you're always taking your colleagues' word for it, to a degree, that they've done their procedures the way they've said they have. They've written about it accurately, they've represented it accurately. But someone eventually is still going to come along and retest it or try to disprove it. And so even the phrase trust the science seems a little hypocritical, because the scientific method is that even scientists don't trust the science. How would you feel about how I presented that?
I think you're 100% spot on. The phrase trust the science is silly. I think it's more trust experts is what should be said. Trust the consensus of experts, because that's the best we have at this moment. You know, like, a lot of this comes out of the pandemic, and like, it's like, oh man, the experts were wrong on this. And it's like, man, that is ridiculous. The very first thing the experts said in 2020 was, this is a new disease. We don't know much about it, right? And our understanding of it will improve with time and studies and experiments and yada, yada, yada. That was what made us so scared, and going into lockdown was the fear of the unknown, because we did not know what that disease was. And so when people use stuff like the pandemic as like saying, hey, we can't trust the experts, we can't trust the science because they made all these misstatements about blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. It's like, man, but every single statement made by scientists was, we're not sure yet. You know, this is new. And people forget that. And then the other problem is in those kind of situations, and this happens all the time in wars or immediate decisions that politicians need to make, like with a pandemic, where you have to make a decision without full information because the decision needs to be made, right? And so what you do is you trust the best information you have, the consensus of experts, and that's all we can do. Our world is built upon expertise that's what lets us talk over these interwebs with each other and other people to eventually see it. It's what lets us fly on airplanes, drive cars, eat food from across the world, etc., live in the buildings we live in. And so it's like, we trust expertise on all these things that we take for granted, but then we somehow don't trust them on these big political, high profile issues. And it's like, when we say trust expertise, what we're saying is don't trust any one expert, trust the consensus. It's not perfect though. It's just the best we got, right? Because it's what the evidence we have says at this point in time. And like, that's all we got. That's what we have to work with. And that's what we're trusting anyway, implicitly with all this other stuff. But when it comes to like some decision on, I don't know, the vaccines or whatever, now we're saying, oh, on this issue, because it's become such a high profile issue, we're saying not to trust them, but we'll still fly in their airplanes that they design.
Right.
Like,
until you mentioned that, it hadn't quite occurred to me that for the pandemic stuff, it wasn't the virology experts that were saying it wasn't okay to question anything they were saying. It was the media and the government. And I think the industry experts, and of course you have where they overlap, which most famously at this point is probably Dr. Fauci, who I don't know if it was a correct quote, but if he ever said, "I am the science," that would obviously be a problematic statement. Like, okay.
Of course.
So, but I think it's important to reflect on it because I hadn't reflected on it until just now. It wasn't the experts in the field who were saying, "Don't ever question anything we say." It was the media and the government who were saying that.
Yeah, and I mean, this all goes back to how do you deal with misinformation? Because remember, at the same time, so in 2020, I remember this really clearly. I don't know, because I was paying attention. I'm a scientist, and I follow a lot of scientists on social media. And like, there was a huge debate among the scientific community over to handle this. Remember, like some nations, their scientists said, let's develop herd immunity, right? So let's not go into lockdown. Other scientists said we should go into lockdown. We have all this evidence that shows that we can cut off the spread. And, every nation responded differently based on how its own local scientific consensus operated. Like, in Greece, where I was, it was really harsh lockdowns. I was living in Greece at the time, and you couldn't even leave your apartment except for 6 reasons, and you needed a permit to leave your apartment. And it was easy to get a permit. You just send a text message. It's an automatic system, but you have to provide which reason you're leaving the permit for. So if you're stopped by police, you have to demonstrate that you're doing it to get exercise for that period in the day, or you're doing it to go shopping because you need to go shopping, or you're doing it to take care of a loved one, or whatever it is. There were 6 good reasons, but that was the only reason you could leave your apartment. It was a really strong lockdown. And in many ways, it was very effective because Greece had very few infections throughout the pandemic until they changed course much, much later. Like a year later, they changed course. And they needed to do that because they were going through their Great Depression at the time. So their medical infrastructure was destroyed. And because of the Great Depression, most young people had left. So their population was very old and very infirm and at risk for the COVID. And so, it was an effective strategy for their context. And they opened up again for tourism and stuff like that, and now they're rebounding. On the other hand, you have countries like Sweden and the UK where they were like, maybe at first in particular, but Sweden, I think, did it throughout, where it was like, no lockdowns, we're going to develop herd immunity and stuff like that. And then you had all these different variations between those two extremes. And there was no real scientific consensus because we didn't understand the disease, right? And it was all new. And so, I think, but the issue is there were all these politicians and influencers who were muddying the waters, if you see what I mean. And just, they get YouTube views or podcast views or whatever, Fox News views by saying scientists are wrong, blah, 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 blah. This is the wrong decision. And it's like, I don't know how to respond to this. I don't know what the right decision is to stop misinformation. All I know is that misinformation and disinformation is even more out of control now than it was in 2020. It's more out of control in 2020 than it was in 2016. And it was more out of control in 2016 than it was in 2012. All I know is over the last 2 decades, we've seen this stuff increase. And I don't really have a good answer, if you see what I mean. I think it's clear that just trying to control information is probably not working. I think it builds into that stigmatized rhetoric I mentioned to you before about I'm being canceled, where the government or YouTube or whatever outlaws a certain kind of speech. I think that builds into the rhetoric misinformation agents and disinformation agents and conspiracy theorists use anyway. And so I'm guessing that that's not so effective, but I don't know what is effective. Even if I've been somewhat effective myself on an individual level, I don't quite know what the right government response is to fake information. And I'm not sure if there is one. I think probably the best government response is to just keep to better boost experts and scientists and things like that, and better training for scientists and scholars on how to communicate better with the public. I think is important. I think and doing a better job of educating the public. I think I don't know. We're entering a scary world as college becomes more expensive and it's less supported. And so therefore there's more ignorance, which therefore fuels more misinformation, which it's like a giant cycle. It kind of sucks.
Well, I like what you said earlier about experts talking to non-experts as if they're adults and not children. And, because I think that's where the distrust comes from is, and it's funny because like so much of this goes back to the pandemic, like you said, is experts being like, I don't need to explain it all to you. You just need to listen to me because I'm an expert. Well, that's how you talk to children,
Yeah, exactly.
And that breeds distrust, But oh damn, I lost. There was something I was going to ask you there. I lost it. But that's okay. I do think experts talking to people like they are adults, I think breeds the trust that would, you said academia is not really cool, but there are so many examples of people who are academics and have gotten into pop culture. And it's probably too late in the interview to ask you for your thoughts about any of them, but someone like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's fucking everywhere.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think we need to have more of a presence. And I mean, that's why I'm trying to, in my free time, trying to build up my YouTube and stuff like that. I mean, I hope to do more of that. I just tooled up with better microphone like the one I'm wearing now, and better camera like the one I'm using now. And so a better computer so I can start doing live streaming and stuff, and try to have more of these conversations, because I think that we need to do that. I think that's the key is, speaking to people like they're adults. But at the same time, that also means when you're just spouting bullshit, I'm going to call you out on it. Right. I'm sorry, but believing in ancient aliens or Atlantis is like believing in Santa Claus. I'm sorry, but it is. That's just the truth. I will sit here and explain to you in depth why the evidence is there. And I think it also, and maybe this is a critique of Neil deGrasse Tyson and maybe some others, and I admit that it's tough when you are the celebrity in a position, and it's you don't want to always answer I don't know. But I think we also need to learn the limits of our own expertise. I think that's really key. I cannot answer questions on everything, and even within the field of archaeology. And we have to learn to embrace the limits of our expertise, and not just have one superstar scientist representing the field, but have a bunch of us maybe who are less superstar-like doing engagement and outreach, so that we complement each other with the messages that we share. And so I think that's key, because, it's like Fauci's in a tough spot, right? It's like the U.S. government needs to make decisions based on his recommendations that are based on him conversing with a bunch of other scientists that have different recommendations, and then him sort of saying, well, this is the consensus and yada, yada. Then he has to go and address that to reporters and journalists and podcasters. And they're like, but how do you know that? And the real answer is we don't know. Right? The real answer, and he says that a lot, of course, which to his credit, but of course, at the same time, you're sort of like, but we're making this decision because we have to make a decision. We can't just sit on our hands and do nothing while there's a pandemic raging. We have to act based on various levels of not knowing and what we do know and whatnot. And so, you know, and at the same time, the administration is saying you have to project confidence so that therefore the people will listen to you, because that's true. We know that projecting confidence actually leads to people listening to you, right? It's true. So politicians sometimes have to act, and people like Fauci have to act more confident than they might be, because that is proven to be effective at getting people to follow public policy. So it's like you have this catch-22. It's always a matter of catch-22s and how to shade it and how not to shade it, and you know, it's tough, right? You know, there's no right catch-all answer for any of this stuff. We live in a tough world.
Yeah. I remembered what I was going to say. One of the most, a really great point that you made that just had not occurred to me before is when you have someone presenting themselves as either an expert or more expert than the experts, but they're making their appeal directly to the uninformed public instead of to their fellow experts. That is a huge red flag of pseudoscience. Is that fair?
100%. Yeah. That to me is one of the easiest ones the public can find. If you see what I mean.
That paradigm creates a situation though where the science that's always going to be most prevalent in popular culture is going to be the pseudoscience, because that's what popular culture is. You're going to the people. You're going to the uninformed people. And so it's always going to be cooler to do a show about ancient aliens than it is going to do a show about why Atlantis doesn't exist.
Of course. Yeah. You look, I mean, that's why it takes expertise, because pseudoscience is more popular than real science, because the only people that can know the real science, especially up to date, are scientists. So, you know, without a doubt, it's like, you know, people say, but I learned this in my history textbook in like middle school about blah, blah, blah. I'm like, do you think your history textbook in middle school was up to date on like the state of archaeology? Like, you have to be kidding me if you think a middle school textbook is able to present like the narrative as scientists think about it, right? And archaeologists and professionals. So yeah, I mean, God, like I have a YouTube video coming out with Joe Hedwig Steinweiss. She's known as the fake history hunter on Twitter and YouTube and whatnot. And she has a book on 101 fake history stuff. And it's like, you know, these are really common things. Like even I believe some of them. You know, I'd have to go check which ones, because they were minor ones, but there were a few that I believe. One really common one that I was just writing about in my book is, you know, Napoleon did not shoot the nose off the Sphinx, right? You know, a lot of people believe that. We have photographs from a generation before, not photographs, art from a generation before Napoleon was born that show the nose off the Sphinx. We have descriptions of the Sphinx having its nose knocked off from the medieval period, from like Islamic medieval historians writing about it. So it's like, we know this for a fact, but it's still super popular. You know, like pseudo history, we learn it in high school. The high school history courses, we learn a lot of it is fake history. It's just how it is. It's just, that's what it is. Same thing with fake science. By the time now, what you learned about science 20 years ago when you were in high school or whatever year, decade it was, it's way out of date, and it's already out of date by the time somebody's writing that textbook. You know, it just is, and it's not possible for it to be up to date, because you know what's up to date is also, you know, like we said, it's very nuanced and complex and whatnot. And we can't synthesize that for 12-year-olds. You know, that's why I talk like this to adults. When I speak to children, I speak a little differently, because you have to make a point that they can understand, right? They're different. Yeah, they have a different sense of the world. Yeah.
This has been a real pleasure, Flint. Where would you like people to find you?
Yeah, I'm mostly on YouTube at Archaeology with Flint Dibble. I'm also on Blue Sky and elsewhere. Just my username is almost always Flint Dibble. I think on Reddit somebody took that, but I didn't really join Reddit till after I was on Joe Rogan. Everybody accused me of being a Redditor, and now I'm like, hey, I have all these fans on Reddit. I got to do stuff on Reddit, but someone created a subreddit for me recently, so I occasionally post in there. But mostly Blue Sky and YouTube are my two main places, but I'll post stuff on Instagram or X or whatever as well. Yeah.
Oh, you're on Blue Sky more than you are on X?
These days, yeah. Most of my colleagues have left Twitter or X for Blue Sky for justifiable reasons. Elon Musk has clearly taken it over with the intention of using it to propagate the kind of information he wants to propagate. So, you know, there's a big movement to boycott X. I don't really think that's the right move, because I think then it just segregates real information while most people are still on X. So I'm still on X. But the thing is, the conversations I'm having are oftentimes with my colleagues. So I spend more time on there. But I still do spend time on X writing little threads or promoting my stuff and engaging with people. But the other reason I have taken more time off from X is that's just where all my enemies are. And they just like troll the shit out of me relentlessly. And it gets tiring. And I'm like, whatever, I'm not going to waste my life just being trolled. I'm going to reach people that want to listen to me. I'm not going to sit there and like go back and forth with some bad faith actor who doesn't want to listen to me at all and just wants to call me names like whatnot. And so it's like, that's my goal. I just want to reach real people where they are at. I'm writing a book on this stuff, and I will be doing a lot more YouTubing this year, especially as I start doing more live streaming. I want to platform a lot of my colleagues to try to get out more real archaeological information. So I want to hope my YouTube becomes more of a hub for real history and archaeology, and especially for like that kind of perspective of what professionals think, and in not in a long form podcast conversation.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I think it's the future. I think it's the future. I mean, the future is now. So, this has been a pleasure, Flint. Thanks for chatting with me about all this.
All right, thanks. Great to meet you. And yeah, I look forward to seeing this out and saying hi to new fans. Yeah.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye.